The job listing said, Overnight Security Associate, Fulfillment Center, Fall River, Massachusetts. $15 an hour, plus a $1.50 shift differential for nights. I read it twice in the parking lot of the Brockton Econo Lodge, sitting in my car with the engine off because running it wasted gas, and then I clicked apply and set my phone face down on the passenger seat. Outside, the lot was half full. A woman in nursing scrubs was loading grocery bags into a Civic 2 spaces over. She glanced at me once, the casual sweep you do when you sense motion nearby, then went back to her bags. Nobody looked at me and saw a problem. That was the thing about civilian life I was still getting used to. People stopped caring what you were. I picked the phone back up and submitted the application. That was a Thursday. They called the following Monday, which I took as a sign of how badly they needed people rather than a sign of my qualifications. The woman on the phone was pleasant and quick. Orientation. Wednesday at 4 p.m, Fall River facility. I wrote the address on the back of a gas station receipt and taped it to the dashboard. I didn't tell anyone. There was nobody to tell. My brother was in Phoenix, and we talked maybe twice a year. Sarah, my wife, separated, not yet legally finalized, had moved to her sister's place in Providence, and we coordinated through a calendar app. I had a box of books, and a box of kitchen stuff, and a box labeled Leo, MISC, in her handwriting, sitting in a hallway I hadn't yet found the nerve to visit. So the calendar stayed empty. I circled Wednesday on the free motel calendar by the door and went back to watching cable news with the sound low and trying not to think too hard about the previous 11 months. The facility was bigger than I'd expected, which is saying something because I'd expected large. I followed a service road off the highway exit for about a mile until the warehouse appeared on my right, low and wide across a flat clearing. It sat pushed back against an old tree line, dense, close-set growth, the kind of trees that have been standing a very long time. And even on a clear Wednesday afternoon, the forest edge looked dark. The parking lot alone was bigger than 3 football fields. The building was clad in pale gray metal siding with floodlights mounted every 30 feet along the roofline, not yet on, but mounted the way things are mounted when the night shift depends on them. I parked in the visitor section and sat for a moment. The building hummed. I could feel it from inside the car, a low vibration rising up through the asphalt in the seat and settling in my chest. It wasn't unpleasant. It was mechanical and regular and asked nothing of you. I got out and went inside. The lobby was fluorescent and clean. A front desk attendant handed me a visitor badge and a form to sign and pointed to a row of chairs where 2 people were already waiting. A kid in his early 20s with a thin beard he was still hoping would fill in, and a woman in her mid-40s with a lunch bag on her lap and the expression of someone who had been through enough orientation sessions to stop finding them interesting. We nodded at each other and waited. At 4:15, a door to the interior opened. The man who came through it was around late 50s, solid in the way that suggests someone had been large once and the mass had simply organized itself differently over time. Close-cropped gray hair. A face that had the quality of old leather, not worn down but toughened. Dark gray uniform with a security patch on the chest and a radio on his hip. He moved through the lobby the way you move when you've walked the same floors for years and don't need to think about where your feet are going. His eyes found the 3 of us, counted, settled into neutral. "Orientation group?" he said. We said yes. "Silas Black, head of overnight security." No handshake. He said it like he was reading from a roster. "Follow me." The tour took close to an hour, and by the end of it, I had a reasonable mental map of the place. The facility ran on a numbered sector system, 1 through 8, arranged around a central conveyor spine that ran the length of the building. Above the main floor, a mezzanine catwalk extended from the north end to the south, running at about 30 feet up with a knee-high railing on the warehouse-facing side. Cameras were mounted every 30 feet along the ceiling trusses. The break room and security office sat near the lobby on the west side. The incinerator chute was on the east wall, behind the returns processing station. Black walked us through all of it and named things. Conveyor control panel, facilities use only, camera feeds pulled to office monitors, checked on each circuit, break room, 15 minutes per shift, not including lunch. He said these things and kept moving. The kid asked if there was a vending machine. Black said yes. I was doing what I've always done in unfamiliar spaces, cataloging details without deciding to. Old cop habit, the exit locations, the angles the cameras covered and the spots they likely didn't. One section, Sector 4, northeast corner, where the overhead lighting was on a slightly different circuit. The color temperature running warmer and marginally dimmer than the rest of the floor, not enough to notice unless you were specifically looking. I was. After the tour, Black brought us back to the security office and gave each of us a laminated card, about the size of a playing card with text on one side. I took mine and caught the header. Overnight Protocol, Fall River FC. Below it, 5 numbered items in clean, small print. "Read those," Black said. "Know them." "What are they for?" the kid asked. Black looked at him for a beat. "This facility has some history with the land it's built on. The protocols keep things running smooth." The kid looked down and read the card. The woman put hers in her pocket. I turned mine over, found nothing on the back, and slipped it into my jacket. "Questions about the protocols?" Black asked. Silence. "Good." He passed out tax forms and badge paperwork, and we filled everything out at the table, and that was orientation. The kid and the woman left at 5:30. I lingered a moment checking my forms, and when I looked up, Black was watching me. "Prior work history says law enforcement," he said. "It does." "You'll want to investigate things," he said. Not a question. I didn't respond. That instinct is a liability here. This job is observation and compliance. You observe, you follow protocol, you call it in if something needs calling in. He held my gaze a moment. "That card matters. Read it before your first shift." I said I would. I drove back to Brockton. The card stayed in my jacket. The first week settled into a routine, and the routine was exactly what I'd been looking for. In at 10, out at 6. Black was always there when I arrived and still there when I left, and in between he moved through the building on a path I never quite tracked. The overnight crew was small. Denise ran the returns processing station on the east side from 10 to 4. Hector did maintenance rounds and worked with the quiet efficiency of someone entirely unbothered by the size or the dark. Terry worked the south dock, a broad, cheerful man whose laugh reached Sector 3 when something struck him funny, which happened often enough that after the second night it stopped startling me. Nobody mentioned the card, nobody pulled me aside with a look. The nights moved in long, quiet intervals, and I let them move through me. I developed a circuit by the third night. Security office north through sectors 1 to 6, then east to returns and the incinerator chute, then up to the mezzanine catwalk north to south, then down and back to the office. 40 minutes per pass. I did it twice a shift with a desk period between for the monitor review. The mezzanine I went through quickly. The catwalk itself was fine structurally, but the lighting up there broke around the overhead trusses into alternating bands of light and shadow, and the railing was low enough to make itself known to the back of your brain on each pass. Nothing specific, just the general unease that large heights and empty space produce in a quiet building at 2 a.m. I logged it as a quirk of the space and moved on each time. The card stayed in my pocket. I told myself I had read it when I had a moment. Then I stopped thinking about it. I'd been in law enforcement long enough to know the difference between a genuine operational directive and a hazing ritual new hires were given to see if they'd ask embarrassing questions. 5 strange rules on a laminated card felt like the latter. It felt like the kind of thing Silas Black used to take the measure of new people, to see who'd comply without asking why and who'd need managing. I wasn't going to be managed. I pocketed it and forgot it. The nights were quiet. I slept clean and flat when I got back to the motel, a dreamless sleep from 6 until noon, and for the first time in close to a year, I wasn't grinding my teeth or waking at 3 in the morning going over the evidence chain that ended my career. The routine was a container, and I was grateful for it. 8 days in, it was working. The 9th night started like all the others. I signed in at 10, nodded at black, started my first circuit. Denise was at her station. I heard Hector's cart squeaking somewhere in the 4-5 corridor. Terry's laugh came rolling down from the south dock at 10:40. By midnight, I was back at the office reviewing the camera feeds with a cup of coffee I was pretending was better than it was, and everything on all 60 feeds looked exactly as it always did. Empty aisles, running belts, the mezzanine walkway empty and striped with shadow. At 1 a.m., I started the second circuit. I was passing through Sector 3 at 1:47 when the light changed. I stopped. Sector 4, the northeast corner, had gone wrong. It wasn't the normal dimness I'd cataloged in week 1. The overhead lights had shifted, or something had shifted beneath them, into a color that I can only call sickly. A dull, deep amber orange that was wrong before I could say why, the way you register the pressure drop before you consciously understand a storm is coming. The spaces between the shelving units in Sector 4 looked deeper than they should. The shadows at the back of the rows looked like they had distance in them, which doesn't make sense to write out, but that's what I saw. I stood at the line between Sector 3 and Sector 4. The hair on my arms was up. My hand went into my jacket pocket for my clipboard and found the laminated card. I pulled it out. Standing under the clean white lights of Sector 3, with the amber glow bleeding at the edge of my vision from the right, I read the card. I read it once fast and once slow. By the end of the second pass, my mouth was dry. They weren't hazing. I understood that immediately and without argument, standing there, with that wrongness in the air. They were specific in the way that only experience makes things specific. The way a veteran detective's notes are specific because someone had already been through it and survived and written down exactly what to do. These rules weren't written to test anyone. They were written because someone had needed them. I was still holding the card when the sound started. It came up through the floor first. That was the thing. Not through the air, but through the concrete itself. A slow, low vibration that had nothing in common with the conveyor hum. The conveyor hum was regular and bright and had rhythm. This was deeper than rhythm. It was a groan, steady and enormous, like something very old and very large, shifting weight it had been holding for a long time. It came from every surface at once, and from the center of the building, and it felt less like a sound and more like a change in pressure, the kind that builds behind your eyes when the elevation changes too fast. I looked at the conveyor line running through the gap between Sectors 3 and 4. I watched the belt. The packages were sliding the wrong way. I looked at the card. Rule 1. I looked in the direction of the sound, toward the deep amber dark at the heart of Sector 4, toward wherever that groan was still rolling out of in long, slow waves. Here's what 11 years on the force does to you. You go toward the problem. Every reflex, every piece of training, every late night spent learning that the sound in the dark is information, and information is the only thing that keeps you and the people around you safe, all of it pointed in one direction. Forward, toward the noise, toward the dark with the wrong light in it, and the belts running backward, and the ancient weight moving in the bones of the building. I put the card back in my pocket. I walked toward the sound. The lights of Sector 3 stayed white behind me. Ahead, the amber dark of Sector 4 waited at the end of the aisle, and the groan moved through the floor under each step, slow and patient, like breathing. I was still a cop. That was the problem. I was still a cop, and somewhere ahead of me in the dark, something already knew it. Sector 4 smelled wrong before I saw anything. I noticed it 2 steps past the boundary line. A low, damp cold that had no business being in a climate-controlled building in June. Not the dry chill of an overworked AC unit. This was older. It hit the back of my throat with the quality of water that had been sitting in the dark a very long time. My grandmother had a root cellar under her house in Dorchester, and in summer it smelled of cold stone and standing water. This was worse than that. The root cellar smelled like earth. This smelled like something beneath the earth. The amber light was worse up close. From the Sector 3 border, it had looked like a circuit issue. Standing inside it, the color sat just outside comfortable, and the shadows between the shelving units were deeper than the fixtures could account for. I looked down the aisle. Packages in their normal configuration. Nothing moved. I kept walking toward the conveyor spine. The groan was still there, slower now, lower, like something that had been holding its breath had begun to exhale. At the end of the main corridor, I stopped and watched the sorter line. The packages were going the wrong way. Not jammed, not cycling from an error. Wrong way, smooth and steady, the belts pulling everything south to north in full reverse. It looked almost normal. The wrongness was only in the direction, and somehow that made it worse than any obvious malfunction. I was stepping back toward the break room when I saw the package. It was on the belt about 20 feet down, easy to pick out because it was dark. Wet. It left a smear on the belt surface as it slid past, and the moisture in the amber light looked almost black. The air around it was colder, a localized cold I felt drop by 10 degrees as it approached. I reached out and stopped it. The moment my hand touched it, I almost let go. Soaked through, heavy, the cardboard soft the way it gets after time underwater. The dark fluid on my palm was cold in a way that hurt, bone deep, like plunging your hand into ice water. And the smell hit me all at once. The same root cellar smell, but concentrated, like pressing your face to a drain. I turned it over. The label was dry and clearly printed. Everything else about the package was degraded, but the label was intact. Resident of the Deep. No address. No return address. No tracking barcode. My right hand moved toward the scanner on my belt. 11 years of evidence processing. You find a thing. You document the thing. My fingers were on the scanner handle before I caught myself. Rule 3. I held still. No scanning. No logging. The rule was telling me specifically not to do the one thing my entire career had trained me to do. I let go of the scanner. I turned east and started walking toward the incinerator chute. The cold from the package was spreading up my forearms. I kept my eyes level, not looking up at the mezzanine. 40 feet to the return station. I pushed through the gate and reached for the incinerator handle when my elbow caught the flashlight clip on my vest. The light came on and swung upward. It swept the mezzanine railing in one wide arc and held. Something was there. It was a face. Pale, leaning over the railing, looking down. The pale wasn't complexion, it was surface. The smooth, absolute surface of the inside of a shell. And where the eyes should have been, the skin simply continued, unbroken. No sockets, no features. A face assembled by something that understood what a face was supposed to look like from a description, but had never seen one. There was nothing to see with, and it was seeing me. I dropped the flashlight. The beam hit the floor sideways, and I was already moving, both hands back on the package, the last 15 feet to the incinerator door. I hit the handle, yanked it open, shoved the package in, slammed it shut. Both hands flat on the door, breathing. The cold was gone. Not gradually, between one breath and the next. The root cellar smell vanished completely. The groan in the floor faded back to the baseline conveyor hum. I stood there and counted my heartbeats to 30 before I turned around. The returns area was empty. The mezzanine above was dark and still. The flashlight was on the floor 6 feet away, still on. throwing a yellow circle on the concrete. I picked it up. I did not shine it upward. The security office was 10 by 12 with a desk, a chair, and the monitor bank, 8 screens running 12 camera feeds on rotation. I came in, shut the door, and sat down. My forearms were still cold where the package had pressed against them. The monitors cycled normally. Sectors 1 through 6, North Dock, South Dock, Mezzanine. I watched the mezzanine feed come up. The catwalk was empty. The lighting up there was normal. I looked at the wall clock. 2:58 a.m. The last rule: do not look into the security monitors after 3 a.m. I had 2 minutes. I watched the North Dock feed the way I used to watch security footage at a scene, systematically, professionally, looking for the shape I'd seen at the railing. The clock hit 3 a.m. I didn't look away. The monitors frosted over. It started at the bezels, a white, crystalline film growing inward, and the feeds disappeared one by one. Before the last screen went white, I saw the shapes in the frost weren't quite the warehouse, same geometry but stretched, distorted, like a reflection in water after a stone drops through it. Then I saw the figure in the glass panel above the monitor bank, the cable management cover, a reflection in it, a man standing behind my chair. Older, compact, in a flat-brimmed cap and brass-buttoned uniform, mid-century postal service. He was holding a bag that moved from the inside, something shifting slowly against the canvas. He raised one arm and pointed to his right. In the building's orientation, that meant south. South exit. Rule 4. I did not turn around. I said nothing. I watched him in the reflection and held still. The radio crackled. "Hey!" Terry's voice, stripped of his usual ease. "Hey! Can someone—" "Mezzanine." Static swallowed the rest. I picked up the radio and started to respond and stopped. The voice changed. A woman's voice. Older. The specific cadence of someone I hadn't heard since a hospital room in 2021. My mother has been dead 5 years, and I know exactly what her voice sounds like, and this was it. The pitch, the pacing, the way her sentences always trailed off waiting for you to finish them. "Leo," she said, "just come up." I set the radio down. The voice shifted. Sarah. The slight roughness in her lower register, the particular way she said my name when she was being patient. "It's okay. Just come up to the mezzanine. I'm waiting." I gripped the edge of the desk with both hands. Every rational thought I had knew what this was. The card in my pocket, the rule, the clear mechanics of what the entity was doing, using voices it had learned from my 3 breaches, using them as a lure to walk me up those stairs. My body heard Sarah's voice and wanted to stand up. I held the desk and let the wanting move through me without acting on it. The radio said my name one more time in her voice and went quiet. I sat in the silence. The frost on the monitors had stopped spreading. In the reflection above the screens, the figure in the postal uniform was gone. Cap, bag, buttons, all of it. Behind my chair was empty floor. I let go of the desk. My hands had gone white at the knuckles. The clock read 3:04 a.m. 3 rules broken in 90 minutes. Rule 1 when I walked toward the sound instead of the break room. Rule 2 when the flashlight swept the mezzanine. Rule 5 when I kept watching the monitors past 3 a.m. I'd followed Rule 3 by about 4 seconds of pure reflex. Muscle memory had nearly beaten the protocol on that one. And Rule 4 I'd held, barely, by not turning around and not speaking. 3 breaches. The thing above me had used each one like a bearing, orienting toward me the way you triangulate a position from signal data. It had the shape of me now. It had my name in the voices of people I'd lost. 30 feet up in the dark of the mezzanine, something without eyes was waiting with complete patience because it had no particular relationship with time and no reason to hurry. I thought about the 3 guards before me. Black had said it without saying it. That card matters. He'd said it with the flatness of someone who had watched people ignore it before and had watched what came next, 3 times. 3 overnight guards who had not, in the end, survived the instruction to take it seriously. I'd treated it as hazing. I'd applied the framework that worked for 11 years, assess the situation, identify the pattern, document, and report. Every single tool I had was wrong for this. Not the situation, not the entity. Me. My tools were wrong. I sat with that. Then I straightened up, turned on the desk lamp, and opened the top drawer. The emergency kit was where I'd seen it since my first week, a red plastic box with standard first responder contents, and along the back of the drawer, 4 road flares banded with a rubber band. I pulled them out and set them on the desk. Flares wouldn't do anything to the thing on the mezzanine directly. Nothing on the cards suggested light repelled it. But light was real. Light was the physical insistence of the normal world operating on its normal terms, and whatever the logos was, it existed in the places the normal world left gaps. The flares were a last resort. I put 2 in my vest pocket and held 2. Then I looked at the frosted monitors and the silent radio and thought about what the remaining rules were actually telling me to do. Rule 4 was the one I'd just held by staying seated. The postal worker, the figure in the reflection, not a fix, a hold. It would need completing. Rule 1 was where everything had started to go wrong. 20 minutes in the break room. The card was specific about the time. Exactly 20 minutes, not 15, not 30. The specificity of a ritual, not the vagueness of a suggestion. I understood, sitting there, that I hadn't yet earned those 20 minutes. The sequence had to complete in order. There were things that needed to happen before the break room would mean anything. Going now would just be hiding. I stood up. I put the flashlight in my vest, off. I opened the office door and stepped out. The floor was loud, the full reverse of the conveyor system, the entire length of the facility, running a rhythm the building wasn't designed for. I stood in the doorway and let my eyes adjust. There was a figure standing between sectors 2 and 3, 60 feet away. Flat-brimmed cap, brass buttons catching the amber light. The mailbag at his side moving slowly from within. I raised my right arm and pointed south. He held still for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the south wall, and between one step and the next he was gone. Not around a corner, simply gone. The aisle empty. The conveyor belts ground to a halt. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard all night. I stood in the doorway and held still in that silence, and understood that the worst of it was still ahead and that it was mine to walk into alone. I gripped the unlit flare in my right hand. Then I turned off the desk lamp behind me and started walking toward the mezzanine stairs. The radio on the desk was still. The frosted monitors glowed faint white in the empty office behind me. My footsteps on the concrete were the only sound left in the building. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a hazing ritual, and it wasn't a breakdown, and it wasn't the stress of 11 months catching up to me in the quiet of a large building at 3 a.m. This was a hunt, and I had just spent 90 minutes telling the hunter exactly where I was. The mezzanine stairs were a straight metal flight at the north end of the main floor, 12 steps up to a landing, and then the catwalk running south from there. I'd walked them twice per shift every night for 9 days without thinking about them. They were just part of the circuit, the same as every other section of the building. I stood at the bottom of them now and looked up. The strip lighting along the catwalk was running normally, same color temperature as the main floor, no amber, no dimming. It looked exactly the way it looked on every other night of my first week here. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. The normalcy of it felt deliberate, the way a room looks right before you realize something in it is wrong. I had the unlit flare in my right hand. The flashlight was back in my vest, off. Rule 2 was already broken. I'd done that in the returns area when my elbow caught the clip. Breaking it a second time wasn't going to change anything. I put my left hand on the railing and started up. The trick with the watch I'd learned in my 3rd year on the force from an older detective named Carver, who talked about procedure the way other people talked about weather, constantly and without prompting. He told me once that the crystal face of an analog watch made a crude mirror. Hold it at the right angle, and you could see around a door frame or a corner without putting your head past the edge. The reflection was small and curved, and you couldn't make out fine details, but you could see shapes and movement, which was usually all you needed. I'd used it maybe a dozen times over 11 years, mostly in building searches, usually in the dark. At the top of the stairs, I stopped and stood on the landing. The catwalk ran away from me in a straight line to the south wall, maybe 80 feet. The railing on the right side opened to the main floor, 30 feet below. I unstrapped the watch from my wrist, tilted it in my hand until I had the angle, and held it up at chest height to catch the reflection of the catwalk ahead of me. The image was small, a compressed strip of grating and railing curved at the edges from the crystal. I adjusted the angle slowly. I found the face about 40 feet down. It was crouched near the knee-high railing on the right side, folded in a way that made the joints look arranged differently than mine. The face was turned toward the stairs, toward me. That smooth, pale surface, the continuous unbroken skin over where eyes would sit, catching the strip lighting and giving back a flat white reflection with no depth in it. It wasn't moving. I kept still. I looked at the small, curved image and made myself breathe and think. It was near the railing. That railing ran the full length of the catwalk and mounted to the wall at the catwalk midpoint, roughly 45 feet from where I stood, was a red box I'd noted during the orientation tour and filed away without thinking about it again. Manual override for the fire suppression system. I'd seen the specs on a laminated sheet in the break room, the one on the wall next to the shift schedule that nobody reads. Total suppression in under 30 seconds from lever activation, chemical foam from the ceiling heads, full coverage. Whatever the logos was, it lived in the quiet and the dark and the spaces where the real world went soft and left gaps. A blast of foam and noise and cold water from every ceiling head at once was the opposite of that. It was the ward made into a weapon. The panel was 45 feet down the catwalk. The entity was crouched 5 feet past it, between the panel and the south wall. I started moving. Watch held at chest height, eyes on the small, curved reflection, not looking directly at the thing, not looking at the railing, not raising the flashlight. Just the image in the crystal and my footsteps on the metal grating, which were louder than I wanted, but there was nothing to be done about that. 20 feet in, the cold started. It was different from the cold of the package, broader, a general drop in the air temperature that came with proximity to the thing rather than to what it had touched. The root cellar smell came in a few steps after, faint at first and then stronger, that specific ancient standing water smell I now recognized without needing to think about what it meant. It had known I was here since the stairs. It was patient in a way that had nothing to do with willpower. In the watch reflection, I saw it shift. Not stand. Adjust. The posture changed, the folded shape against the railing realigning, the head moving fractionally toward me, the smooth surface catching the strip light at a new angle. 30 feet in. The panel was 15 feet ahead. The thing was 25 feet beyond it. I was closing the distance, and it was tracking me without moving, orienting in the way a predator orients when it knows the prey is coming and sees no reason to hurry. I thought about the voices on the radio, my mother's voice, Sarah's voice, each one accurate enough that for one moment, just one, my body had believed it. It had spent my 3 breaches learning the shape of me, what I cared about, what I was afraid of losing. The entity was a good hunter. I could acknowledge that without letting it mean anything. 15 feet to the panel. The cold was working into my hands now, slowing my fingers, putting my thinking slightly behind. I kept the watch angled and kept walking. Then it moved, sideways, along the railing. The motion had a quality I can only describe as approximate. like watching something that understood movement from the outside, but hadn't had enough practice to make it look easy. It slid 3 feet and stopped, positioning itself directly adjacent to the red panel on the wall. I stopped too. 10 feet of catwalk between me and the panel. The entity at the railing 5 feet past it. The strip lighting ran between us, steady and fluorescent and completely indifferent to the situation. In the watch crystal, the face was clear now. The smooth brow, the unbroken skin where eyes should be, the lower half equally featureless where a mouth would be. The proportions were almost right. It had the measurements of a human head. But it was like a thing made from a description by someone who had never actually seen a face. And the wrongness of it was in the precision, how close it was to being correct, and how completely it wasn't. The lower surface moved. The skin shifted, folded, and the sound that came out wasn't a voice and wasn't mechanical noise. It was the groan. The same subsonic rumble I'd been feeling in the floor since 1:47 a.m., but coming from the face now, directed at me, pressing against my chest like a hand laid flat over my sternum. I took 1 step back. It slid 1 step forward, toward the panel. I understood. It was cutting off my route to the override. It didn't need to chase me. It needed me to not reach that lever. Herding. An ambush predator that had shifted tactics when the ambush didn't work. I stopped moving back. I looked at the watch reflection one last time and fixed the position. Red box, wall-mounted, hinged cover, single pull lever. 2 seconds if I moved fast and didn't stop. I put the watch in my pocket. I kept my eyes on the catwalk grating under my feet, and I moved. Not looking up, not looking right. The pale shape, a presence in my peripheral vision at the railing, acknowledged, not engaged. Eyes on the metal grid, counting my steps because I had the distance. 5, 6, 7. The cold hit me like stepping into a freezer. The smell was thick. At my right shoulder, something was there, not touching me, present in that way you feel a person standing too close, a displacement, the edge of a presence your body registers before your brain catches up. 8 steps. My left hand hit the wall. I slid it sideways along the surface and found the raised lip of the panel housing. It was right there. Right shoulder. Inches. Not touching me. I don't know what kept it from touching. Maybe it needed me to look at it first, to acknowledge it directly the way I'd acknowledged the radio by picking it up, the way looking into the monitors at 3 a.m. had given it a line back to me. Maybe the eyes on the floor were a refusal it couldn't breach without my cooperation. Whatever the reason, it stayed at my shoulder, and the groan from it was building, pressing harder, and in that groan, I could hear something trying to form that was not my mother's voice and not Sarah's. The sound the Logos made before it borrowed someone else's voice. What it sounded like was the building itself, in low, continuous pain. I flipped the panel cover. The hinged metal swung up. My hand found the lever. I pulled it. The ceiling came apart. Every suppression head in the mezzanine section fired at once, and the foam came down in a white wall, high pressure, the roar of it swallowing everything in an instant. Not a sound, a percussion. It hit me in the chest, and the ears simultaneously. The chemical foam was colder than the water, colder than the cold of the entity's presence, and within 2 seconds, I was soaked through to the skin and completely blind, the foam filling my vision and running into my collar. Then the pain. Behind my eyes and at the base of my skull, at the place where the spine meets the brain. Not the pain of an injury, the pain of a frequency the human body was not built to receive. A silent shriek, 2 seconds long, directed. It had no volume because it had no sound. It was purely pressure, purely wrong, and then it stopped as completely as it had started. I was on my knees on the wet metal grating, both hands over my ears, which did nothing because the sound had been internal. I stayed that way for a moment. Then I took my hands down, opened my eyes, and looked. foam everywhere. White and dense on the railing and the grating and the wall. The strip lighting still on, filtered now through haze, casting everything in a washed-out white. To my right, the railing section was empty. No shape crouched against it, no pale, smooth surface. The cold was gone. The ancient water smell was gone. What was left was the ordinary cold of wet clothes and air conditioning and industrial foam, which is a completely normal and manageable kind of cold. I sat on the wet catwalk for a minute and let the shaking in my hands run its course. It took about 60 seconds. Then I stood up, found the wall, followed it to the stair housing, and came down one step at a time to the main floor. The conveyor belts were still. The amber in Sector 4 was gone. The overhead lights ran white and even. The building sounded like it was supposed to sound. The hum, the baseline mechanical breathing of a functioning facility. I walked to the break room. The clock on the wall said 3:41 a.m. I sat in the chair closest to the door and laid my hands flat on the table in front of me and looked at the clock face. Rule 1. Break room for exactly 20 minutes. I'd broken it first, back at the start of all of this, when I'd walked toward the sound at 1:47 a.m. instead of here. But the break room was the end of the sequence, the ritual parameter that closed the loop. Not a punishment, and not a hiding place. A deliberate disruption of the thing's hunting cycle, a formal statement made with time instead of words. 20 minutes of absence, exact, after everything else had been addressed. That was the ritual. I was at the end of it now. I watched the second hand on the clock. 3 minutes in, my hand stopped shaking. 7 minutes in, the pressure behind my eyes was gone. 12 minutes in, the conveyor hum came back, the normal forward rhythm, the one I'd spent a week learning to stop consciously hearing. It had come back at some point, and it sounded exactly as it was supposed to. 15 minutes in, I thought about Sarah. Not the voice. The actual Sarah. The one whose handwriting was on a cardboard box in a hallway in Providence that I hadn't found the nerve to go pick up. I thought about her for maybe half a minute. Then I let the thought settle and went back to watching the clock. 20 minutes. I stood up. I pushed the chair in. I walked to the door and out onto the main floor. The warehouse hummed. The belts ran forward. The lights were white across all 8 sectors, and nothing moved in the shadows between the shelving units, except my own reflection in a Sector 2 safety mirror as I walked past it. Back in the office, I sat down and looked at the monitors. The frost was gone, every feed cycling normally. The mezzanine camera showed the catwalk coated in foam, suppression heads still dripping, railing empty and wet. Everything as it should be. I took the laminated card from my jacket pocket, damp from the foam. I read all 5 rules beginning to end. Then I took the blank notepad from the top drawer and wrote out all 5 rules from memory. 1 per line, neat and legible, and checked them against the card. I had them right. I closed the notepad and put it in my vest pocket next to the 2 unused flares. The night had 3 hours left in it. I picked up my clipboard and started my 3rd circuit of the building, walking the long empty aisles. The hum was just the hum. The shadows were just the shadows. For now. The last 3 hours of the shift were quiet. I did a 3rd circuit and then a 4th, which I hadn't done before. The routine was 2 per shift, but the routine had been built by a man who didn't know what was in the building. I knew now. I walked all 4, moving through each sector in sequence, checking the things I was supposed to check, marking the clipboard at each station. The conveyor belts ran forward the whole time. The lights stayed white across all 8 sectors. Sector 4 was the same marginally warm dimness it always was on a normal night. Nothing more, nothing different. I noted that on the clipboard anyway, because noting things was the reflex I had, and I saw no reason to stop it. At 4:15, I checked the incinerator chute. The indicator light on the housing showed the interior was still above operating temperature. The package had burned completely. No residue. I stood at the door with my hand on the housing for a moment, and then moved on. At 4:30, I passed the return station. Denise had left at 4, same as every night, her workstation powered down and coat hook empty. At 4:45, the south dock was locked and dark. Terry gone at the same time as Denise. Everything where it was supposed to be. Nothing that shouldn't be there. By 5:30, I was at the security office desk, filling in the night's incident report. I sat with the pen over the form for a while before I started writing anything. The form wanted incident type, location, time, description, action taken. I thought about what was true and what was technically true, and where the line between those two things sat on a document going into a facility records file. Then I wrote, mezzanine-level fire suppression system was activated at approximately 0330 hours due to sensor anomaly. System performed as designed. No personnel were present in the affected zone at time of activation. Mezzanine catwalk and suppression heads require inspection and cleaning before the next operational cycle. Recommend facilities team review prior to day shift. All of it was technically true. I signed it, dated it, and put it in the night report slot. The notepad I'd started during the shift was still in the desk drawer, the blank one I'd used to write out the 5 rules from memory and check them against the card. I folded it and put it in my vest pocket next to the 2 road flares I hadn't needed. The laminated card went back in my jacket pocket, warped and slightly stiff from the foam, but still legible. At some point, I made a cup of coffee from the break room machine and came back to the desk and sat and drank it and waited for the clock to reach 6. I watched the monitor feeds cycle through their 2-minute rotation. The mezzanine feed showed the catwalk coated in foam residue, suppression heads still dripping, railing empty. Everything as it should be. I went out through the north dock door at 5:55. The overnight staff used the lobby entrance, but I wanted to be outside and sitting, and the dock steps were there, a short concrete flight from the dock door to the service road, facing east toward the old tree line. The same dense, close-set growth I'd noticed the first day when I'd pulled off the service road and sat in my car and felt the building hum through the seat. It looked the same now as it had then. Whatever had happened inside the building over the last 4 hours, the trees were exactly the same trees. I sat on the top step with my damp clothes starting to stiffen as they dried and my arms resting on my knees. The sky was doing what it does in early June at that hour, dark blue giving way to gray, giving way to the pale color that isn't night but isn't quite dawn either, the light coming up from behind the trees in flat, colorless bands. For the first time in 11 months, the evidence locker wasn't running in the back of my head. The internal affairs review, the resignation letter, the drive to Brockton with 2 boxes in my trunk. Those things were still true, still the shape of my life as it was now. But they were sitting somewhere behind me in the quiet, and I was looking at the tree line instead of turning to look at them. At 5:58, I heard a car on the gravel. A door. Footsteps that came past me without stopping and went through the dock door into the building. I stayed on the steps. Silas Black was inside for about 4 minutes. Then the door opened, and he came out and stood at the top of the steps. He didn't sit. He stood the way he always stood, like a man who'd made a decision long ago not to fully settle into any place. "Incinerator's still hot," he said. "I used it," I said. He came down 1 step. "Mezzanine's going to need work. Suppression system triggered. Sensor anomaly. It's in the report." He was quiet for a moment. I kept my eyes on the tree line. "Mezzanine suppression is on a separate trigger circuit from the main sensors," he said. "Sensor anomalies don't activate it. Manual does." I didn't say anything to that. He held out his hand. I reached into my jacket and took out the laminated card. Warped, dried foam across the bottom third. Text still clear on both passes. I put it in his hand. He looked at it for a moment, then closed his fingers around it and put it in his own jacket. "How many did you break?" he said. 3. Rule 1, Rule 2, Rule 5. He nodded. not agreement, just acknowledgement, the flat registration of a fact. 3, he said, and you're sitting here. Rule 3 I followed. Rule 4 I held in the office and completed on the floor. I pointed south. He left. The belt stopped. Black looked at the tree line for a long moment. The light was coming up properly now, the flat gray giving way to pale yellow at the eastern edge where the sun was starting to clear the treetops. You did better than the last 3, he said. I'd been thinking about the last 3 since 3:04 a.m. 3 overnight guards before me, 3 people who had received the same card and had not, at the end of their respective nights, been sitting on dock steps watching June light come up between trees. I'd thought about them in the break room counting the second hand. I'd thought about them on the 3rd circuit and the 4th. I hadn't reached any conclusions, just carried the number the way you carry a number when it has people attached to it. How many did they break? I asked. Doesn't matter, he said. They broke enough. He didn't say anything else about them. I didn't push. Somewhere out on the highway a truck passed, its sound traveling clear and flat across the morning air before fading. 3, I said. And it still worked out. Black turned his head and looked at me. Not the flat tally from orientation night, something with more weight in it. The look of a man who has been watching for a particular result and is trying to confirm he's seeing it. This time, he said. The 2 words settled in the air between us, and I let them settle. I understood what they meant. The entity wasn't gone. The suppression system had severed its hold on this particular night, disrupted the specific configuration I'd created with 3 breaches in 90 minutes. The ward restored, the hunting cycle broken, the thing back in the deep shadows where it lived when it wasn't active. But next week the building would still be here. The mezzanine would be cleaned and inspected, and the catwalk would go back to looking the way it always looked. The thing would still be there in the negative space between defined places, the same as it had always been. It was eternal. Black had been doing this for years. The last 3 guards were gone. This was one night of something that didn't end. This time, I said. He nodded and looked back at the tree line. We sat in the growing light for a while without talking. Somewhere in the main lot, the first day shift cars were starting to pull in. At 6:10, Black stood up from the step and went back inside without another word. He'd said what needed saying. I stayed on the steps for another 20 minutes. I kept the job. Not because I lacked options, but because I understood now what the job actually was. The laminated card was not hazing, and not a test, and not corporate policy. It was a set of protocols a building required to function as a building instead of something else, and someone needed to be here overnight to follow them, and that someone needed to understand what they were following them for. I bought a composition notebook from a Brockton drugstore the next day. 5 rules on the first page in clean block letters. A blank second page. The 3rd page was the beginning of a running log. Date, shift, observations, conveyor status, package labels checked, sector 4 condition, mezzanine. Case file format, because case files were the language I thought in and the tool wasn't the problem, only the assumptions I'd been applying it to. I came in 30 minutes early each night. I read the rules from the notebook's first page before each shift. Not because I didn't know them, I had them memorized front to back within a week of that night, but because the reading was part of the preparation. The same way you check your gear before going in regardless of how many times you've done it before. The act of checking has its own value, separate from whether you'd have remembered without it. The nights were quiet, not empty. The building was never actually empty, and I knew now what occupied the parts of it I couldn't see. The quiet of a normal night was the quiet of the ward holding, the thing in the deep shadows kept in the deep shadows by routine and protocol, and the simple fact of a human presence moving through the building with its eyes forward and its hands doing what they were supposed to do. I'd learned to read that quiet the way you learn to read any place you've spent enough time in, as a language with its own texture and vocabulary. In August, I moved out of the Brockton Motel, found a one-bedroom in Fall River, 7 minutes from the facility. The boxes from Sarah's sister's place in Providence came with me in 2 trips. I unpacked them over a weekend, put the books on shelves and the kitchen things in cabinets. The box labeled Leo, Am-esque in Sarah's handwriting, I opened on a Sunday afternoon. A coffee mug I'd had since college, some photographs, a Bruins pennant I'd forgotten I owned. I put them all away in their places without making too much of it. I called Sarah in September, not about the boxes, just a call. We talked for about 20 minutes, and it wasn't what it used to be and wasn't supposed to be. When we hung up, I sat on the couch in the Fall River apartment and felt the specific shape of what was gone and let it be the shape it was without trying to make it anything different. Then I went to work. Terry still laughed too loud from the South Dock. Denise still left at 4 on the dot. Hector moved through the building on his rounds with the same quiet efficiency he'd had since my first night. Black was always there when I arrived and still there when I left, and I understood by now that this wasn't about shift coverage. The building was the shape his life had taken around itself over the years, the same way it was becoming the shape of mine. There was a loneliness in that which I recognized from the inside and didn't try to name out loud. Some things are understood without needing to be said. One night in October, I came down from the mezzanine and was halfway across the main floor before I realized I hadn't thought about anything except the circuit the whole time I was up there. Not the railing, not the watch trick, not the pale, smooth surface I'd seen 40 feet down the catwalk on the 9th night. Just the handrail and the grating under my feet and the view of the main floor through the railing gaps and the routine carrying me forward. I stopped in Sector 3 and noticed that and let it register. Then I kept walking. I passed the mezzanine stairs on the next circuit and didn't look up, not from fear, but because looking every time would mean it was always an event, and it wasn't an event anymore. It was the stairs. I passed the monitor bank near the lobby on my return and didn't glance at it because I'd reviewed the feeds from the desk at 11:30 and they'd been clean, and I'd noted that and moved on. The building hummed. The belts ran forward. Sector 4 burned white with the rest of the floor. Somewhere in the deep shadows between the shelving units, in the negative space where the light didn't quite reach, and the camera housings had their blind angles, and the hum of the machinery was a fraction off its usual pitch, something old and patient and hungry sat in the dark, the way it had sat since before this building was built, and would sit long after the last conveyor belt rusted through. And I walked my beat, and I checked my labels, and I kept the ward whole, and the building kept running. That was enough. For now, it was enough.